she wasn't supposed to fall in love with the emperor, and it was going to kill her. This is Lady Kiritsubo, and her forbidden romance would create the most beautiful, most dangerous man in Japanese history. But here's the twist. This isn't just a love story. It's the origin of the world's first psychological novel, written by a woman whose name we don't even know. Buckle up, because what happened next changed literature forever. But before we dive into the world of forbidden love, impossible choices, and the woman who created literature's greatest masterpiece while living in the shadows, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy discovering these incredible untold stories from history. And let me know in the comments what part of Genji's story shocked you most, or if you've ever read the Tale of Genji yourself. It's always fascinating to connect with fellow history lovers as we explore the moment that changed literature forever. Japan, 1000 AD. Lady Kiritsubo is hiding in her palace room, pregnant and terrified. Every day she hears the whispers echoing through the corridors, harsh, cutting words that follow her everywhere. Look at her, thinking she's so special, a nobody from nowhere. This won't end well. You have to understand, in medieval Japan, this was social suicide. Lady Kiritsubo was nobody, a minor court official's daughter in a world where your family bloodline was everything. Think of it like a commoner dating a celebrity, except the consequences were literally life and death. But the emperor couldn't stay away from her. She was arranging flowers when he walked by, and something about the way she moved, this unconscious grace, made him stop dead in his tracks. When their eyes met, boom, game over. He felt like he'd been waiting his entire life for this moment. The other women at court, think mean girls but with political power and the ability to destroy your life. The higher-ranking consorts had always assumed the emperor's attention was theirs by right. Watching him obsess over this upstart, they were furious. Here's where it gets really crazy. Instead of their cruelty driving him away from her, it pulled him closer. Every night he'd find her crying in her chambers after another day of subtle humiliations, and his heart would break all over again. Imagine loving someone so much that their pain becomes your pain. That's where we are. "Why must they hate me so?" she'd whisper. "Because they fear you," he'd reply. "They see what I see, that you're more precious than all of them combined." But the stress was killing her. Literally. The constant hostility, the pressure, the weight of knowing that her love was disrupting the entire political balance of the court. It was crushing her delicate health. And then she got pregnant. Drop a comment if you can imagine the chaos that erupted. The news spread through the palace like wildfire, and suddenly everyone realized this wasn't just a fling anymore. But then a fortune teller arrived with news that would change everything. When Lady Kiritsubo's son entered the world, even the midwives gasped. This baby was luminous, literally glowing, with an otherworldly beauty that seemed too perfect for a human child. The emperor took one look at his son and felt his heart stop. But along with the joy came a terrible realization. This perfect, beautiful child could never inherit the throne. His mother's low status made that impossible, no matter how worthy he might prove to be. But then a Korean fortune teller was brought in to read the baby's features, and his words were both blessing and curse. "This child has the marks of supreme nobility. He could rule the world, but I see shadows. Great love will bring great suffering." The emperor understood immediately, but there was something else in that prophecy that terrified him, the mention of suffering. Because Lady Kiritsubo's health was getting worse. Despite the best doctors, despite prayers at every temple in the capital, she continued to fade. 3 months after giving birth to the most beautiful child anyone had ever seen, Lady Kiritsubo died, leaving behind a grief-stricken emperor and a motherless baby whose radiance seemed to grow brighter each day. But here's what nobody knew yet. This tragic love story was just the beginning. Because that beautiful, doomed child would grow up to become the most complicated, most fascinating character in all of literature. His name would be Genji, and his story It's about to get so much more intense. Imagine being the most beautiful child anyone has ever seen, but knowing you'll never get what should be yours by right. That was Genji's childhood. By age 2, his beauty was legendary. Servants would literally stop working just to stare at him. By age 5, he was reading texts that challenged adult scholars and composing poetry that made grown men weep. But beauty can be a curse as much as a blessing. "Look at him," the other consorts would whisper as he passed, "so proud, as if he doesn't know what he really is." What he really was, in their minds, was a constant reminder of their failure to capture the emperor's complete devotion. Even in death, his mother haunted the palace through her son's face. You have to understand, young Genji was impossibly intelligent. At 3, he could memorize complex poems after hearing them once. At 4, he was creating his own verses. At 5, he was understanding Chinese philosophy that stumped his tutors. The emperor felt pride and heartbreak in equal measure. Here was a mind capable of ruling an empire, trapped in a body that could never sit on the throne. The turning point came during the Cherry Blossom Festival, when Genji was 7. Picture the most beautiful child you've ever seen, dressed in robes that seemed to glow in the sunlight, performing traditional dances with unconscious grace. The entire court fell silent, mesmerized. That's when someone whispered the nickname that would follow him forever, the Shining Prince. But with that recognition came danger. The Minister of the Right's daughter, whose son was the official heir, requested a private meeting with the emperor. "Your Majesty," she said, "the court is talking. They say your younger son outshines the heir apparent in every way. They whisper that maybe merit should matter more than legitimacy." The emperor felt ice in his veins. His beautiful, brilliant son was becoming too prominent, too admired. In a world where perception shaped reality, the Shining Prince was starting to look too much like what a crown prince should be. That night, holding his sleeping son, the emperor knew everything was about to change. To protect Genji, to give him any chance at a meaningful life, he'd have to do something unprecedented in imperial history. He was going to have to let his son go. But the emperor's solution? Nobody saw it coming. What the emperor decided to do had never been done before in the entire history of Japan. He was going to give his son a surname. I know that doesn't sound dramatic to us, but listen, in Imperial Japan, princes didn't have family names. They were beyond such things, part of the divine imperial line. But a surname would remove Genji from succession forever, transforming him from a prince into a nobleman. Think about the psychology here. The emperor was essentially saying, "I love you too much to let you waste your life as a useless prince. I'm going to make you a commoner so you can become great." When the emperor told 8-year-old Genji about this decision, the boy's response floored everyone. "It means I can never be emperor," Genji said calmly, "but it also means I can be something else, something of my own making." The wisdom in those words from such a young child nearly broke his father's heart. The ceremony was private, witnessed only by the highest officials. As the proclamation was read, transforming Prince Genji into Lord Genji of the Minamoto clan, the boy stood perfectly still, showing nothing of what he felt. But that night, alone in his chambers, Genji wept for the first time since his mother's death. Here's the incredible part though. Freed from the impossible pressure of imperial expectations, Genji's natural talents exploded. He mastered music until his performances moved people to tears. His poetry took on depths that amazed seasoned writers. His skill at mixing incense became legendary. Most remarkably, he developed an almost supernatural ability to read people. It was like his sensitivity to his own precarious position gave him insight into everyone else's vulnerabilities. By his 12th birthday, Genji had become the most accomplished young man in the capital. Court ladies would find excuses to walk past wherever he was studying, hoping for a glimpse of his radiant smile. But with these gifts came new challenges. Genji was becoming aware of the effect he had on people, especially women. And that's when everything got complicated. Because the day that would change his life forever was about to arrive, the day he met Lady Fujitsubo. And what happened between them? It would create one of the most scandalous secrets in imperial history. Lady Fujitsubo arrived at court like a vision from another world. She was the emperor's newest consort, but here's the disturbing part. She'd been chosen specifically because she looked exactly like Genji's dead mother. The resemblance was uncanny. Same delicate features, same graceful movements, same indefinable quality that made you feel like you were witnessing something precious. When the emperor first saw her, tears came to his eyes. It was like his lost love had been returned to him. For 15-year-old Genji, seeing Lady Fujitsubo was devastating. Picture this. You're a teenager, you've never known your mother, and suddenly this woman appears who's everything you imagined she might have been. Except she's completely forbidden to you. She's your father's woman, about to become empress. The first time they were alone together changed everything. She'd asked for his help with Chinese poetry, and they sat in her chambers as he explained the complex meanings. "You have your mother's intelligence," she said softly. "The emperor told me she was extraordinarily learned." The mention of his mother, her proximity, the subtle fragrance of her perfume, it overwhelmed Genji's carefully maintained composure. Without thinking, he reached out and touched her hand. The moment stretched between them, electric with possibility and danger. In her eyes he saw a reflection of his own confusion and desire. She was lonely too, trapped by circumstances beyond her control. But then reality crashed back. She pulled away and stood abruptly. "Oh, you must go," she whispered. "This cannot happen." Too late. The connection was forged. What followed was months of secret poetry exchanges, each message bolder, more desperate. They were playing with fire and both knew it, but neither could stop. Think about the risk they were taking. If discovered, it wouldn't just be scandal, it would be treason. And then Lady Fujitsubo missed her monthly courses. The pregnancy was announced with great ceremony. The emperor was overjoyed, the entire court celebrated. Only 2 people in the palace knew the devastating truth. The child wasn't the emperor's. Can you imagine carrying that secret? Every celebration felt like torture. Every expression of joy from his father was a reminder of their terrible betrayal. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn, because Genji's capacity for scandal was just getting started. Those 9 months were the longest of Genji's life. Every public celebration of the coming birth felt like a knife in his heart. Lady Fujitsubo avoided him completely, refusing even to acknowledge his presence. When their eyes accidentally met, the pain was almost unbearable. The birth came during a terrible storm. As rain lashed the palace and thunder shook the buildings, Lady Fujitsubo labored to bring Genji's son into the world. When the baby arrived, he was perfect. And here's the part that made Genji's blood run cold. When the emperor first held his supposed son, he said, "He looks like Genji did at this age." Several courtiers nodded in agreement. Can you imagine? The resemblance was right there for everyone to see, but it was dismissed as family bloodline coincidence. The baby was named Prince Riezai and designated as a potential heir to the throne. Genji watched his own son receive the honors and recognition that he himself had been denied. The irony was almost too bitter to bear. Every day, Genji had to watch his father play with the child who was actually his own son. Picture that psychological torment, seeing your flesh and blood treated as someone else's heir, knowing you can never claim him, never hold him as your own. But here's what's absolutely wild about this story. It gets so much worse. Because Genji's problems with forbidden desire, they were just getting started, and the next woman who would capture his attention would be someone even more vulnerable, even more innocent than Lady Fujitsubo. Her name was Murasaki. She was 10 years old. And what Genji did to her would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. Genji first saw her playing in a mountain temple garden, and something about the scene made him stop and stare. She couldn't have been more than 10, with long black hair that caught sunlight like silk and movements that had unconscious grace beyond her years. But what really caught his attention was who she reminded him of, Lady Fujitsuba. Think about this for a second. Genji has just created a massive scandal with one woman who reminded him of his mother, and now he's fixated on a child who reminds him of that woman. The psychological implications are disturbing. Her name was Murasaki. It means lavender, and she was basically an orphan. Her father was a prince, but had no time for her. Her mother was dead. She had no one to protect her interests. Genji approached her father with a proposal. Let me become her guardian. I'll provide the finest education, ensure her future, raise her as my own ward. The father, overwhelmed and secretly relieved, agreed immediately. For Genji, taking Murasaki into his household felt like a chance at redemption. Here was a relationship uncomplicated by politics or forbidden desire. He could be simply a guardian. He installed her in the most beautiful wing of his palace, surrounded her with the finest tutors, personally oversaw her education in music, poetry, and painting. You learn faster than any student I've ever had, he told her one afternoon. That's because you're a wonderful teacher, she replied with innocent directness. I want to please you. Imagine hearing those words and feeling your heart warm with genuine affection. For the first time in years, Genji had found someone whose happiness wasn't tangled up with politics or scandal. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. As Murasaki grew from child to young woman, Genji's feelings began to change. By her 14th birthday, he could no longer deny what was happening. His protective guardianship was transforming into desire. The crisis came on her 15th birthday. They were having a private celebration, and as the evening progressed, wine loosened Genji's restraint. Murasaki, he said softly, reaching out to touch her cheek. You have become so beautiful. The trust in her voice when she responded should have stopped him, should have reminded him that she was his ward, that he'd sworn to protect her. Instead, it inflamed his desire beyond reason. What happened next was the destruction of everything pure in both their lives. What Genji did that night would define the rest of both their lives. For him, it was the culmination of years of growing desire, a moment when his self-control finally snapped. He'd told himself so many lies about his feelings for Murasaki that he was protecting her, honoring her, that their relationship was pure. For Murasaki, it was the destruction of her entire world. She had never suspected him of such horrid ideas. The man who had been father, teacher, and protector for 5 years had suddenly transformed into something she didn't recognize. The trust that had been the foundation of her existence was shattered in a single moment. When Genji returned the next morning, expecting perhaps gratitude or acceptance, he found her still weeping. His response? What a fuss you're making! He genuinely couldn't understand her distress. In his mind, what had happened was natural, inevitable, even honorable. He was prepared to make her his wife. What more could she want? But Murasaki couldn't explain what he had taken from her. She had no words for the violation she felt, no framework for understanding that love was supposed to be freely given, not supposedly claimed by the powerful. Here's the heartbreaking part. Murasaki realized she had no other options. As Genji reminded her, a young woman without family protection faced only 2 choices, becoming a nun or drowning herself in the sea. You saved me from that fate, he said, as if sexual coercion was rescue. Now I can give you everything, position, security, honor. The logic was unassailable, even if it was morally corrupt. Murasaki began to understand that her survival depended on making the best of an impossible situation. So she did something remarkable. She began to rebuild their relationship on her own terms. When he praised her beauty, she turned conversations to poetry. When he tried to treat her like a child, she demonstrated her intelligence. When he took her compliance for granted, she reminded him that she had choices, even if they were limited. Imagine having to survive by transforming your trauma into strength. That's what Murasaki did. Over the years, something unexpected emerged. Their relationship evolved into something that satisfied them both, though it could never erase the violence of its origins. Murasaki became the acknowledged head of Genji's household, his true wife despite her lack of official status. But the cost was enormous. Murasaki never trusted completely again, never felt safe enough to be truly vulnerable, and Genji lost something essential about himself when he chose desire over honor. When love finally came between them, real, deep, lasting love, it was shadowed by that original betrayal. But wait until you hear what else Genji was up to during this time, because his relationship with Murasaki was just one thread in an incredibly complex web of romantic entanglements. Here's something that will shock you about Genji. Murasaki wasn't his only woman, not even close. This guy was what historians politely call irrepressibly amorous, which is a nice way of saying he couldn't stop seducing women. Any women. All women. Married women? Check. Teenage girls? Check. His own wards? We've covered that. The daughters of his best friends? Absolutely. The friends of his daughters? You bet. And here's the wild part. In Heian Japan, this wasn't seen as scandalous. It was normal behavior for a man of his status to have a main wife, subordinate wives, and various women he'd seduced along the way. But Genji wasn't a typical nobleman. He was generous to a fault with his conquests. He never abandoned any woman he'd been with, housing them all in his vast palace complex, continuing to care for them even when his passion moved elsewhere. Picture this. Genji's household was like a small city populated entirely by women who loved him. You had Murasaki as the acknowledged head wife, but also dozens of other women in various stages of relationships with him. It sounds like a fantasy, right? But the reality was more complex. These women formed their own networks, their own hierarchies, their own systems of support. They raised each other's children, protected each other's interests, and found ways to coexist in this impossible situation. What made Genji so irresistible wasn't just his beauty, though that was supernatural. He had this almost pheromonal quality. People would literally smell his presence before seeing him. Women in his palace would say it was as if blooms opened in spring around him. But more than physical attraction, Genji possessed an intuitive understanding of what each woman needed. He could read their desires, their fears, their dreams, and he tailored his approach accordingly. He made each woman feel like she was the center of his universe, at least in the moments he was with her. The result was a household full of women who genuinely loved him, despite sharing him with dozens of others. It was polyamory on an imperial scale, managed with the skill of a master diplomat. But even Genji's legendary charm couldn't prevent every crisis, and the most dangerous situation of his life was about to unfold, one that would force him into exile and threaten everything he'd built. Genji's downfall came from the one place he should have known to avoid, the imperial family. Her name was Oboro-Zukio, Misty Moon, and she was the sister of the Kokiden consort, one of the most powerful women at court. Getting involved with her wasn't just adultery, it was political suicide. But Genji couldn't resist the challenge. Here was a woman who belonged to his enemies, who represented everything that opposed his influence at court. Seducing her felt like the ultimate victory. Their affair began during a poetry competition at the palace. Genji sent her a verse so beautiful, so perfectly crafted to appeal to her specific sensibilities that she couldn't ignore it. One poem led to another, secret meetings began, and soon they were conducting a full-blown romance under the noses of the most dangerous people in the empire. What Genji didn't realize was that the Kokiden faction had been waiting for exactly this kind of mistake. They'd watched his growing influence with alarm, seen how the emperor favored him despite his reduced status, and they knew they needed ammunition to bring him down. When they discovered his affair with Oboro-Zukio, they had everything they needed. The scandal erupted just as a new emperor was ascending to the throne. Ironically, Prince Riezai, Genji's own secret son. But Riezai was too young to protect Genji, and the regency was controlled by Genji's enemies. Picture the political chaos. The most beloved man at court, the emperor's favorite son, suddenly revealed as an adulterer who had violated one of the most powerful families in the empire. The calls for his punishment were immediate and vicious. Genji found himself facing a choice: stay and fight, risking not just his own destruction but potential civil war, or accept exile and hope for eventual redemption. The decision was agonizing. Leaving meant abandoning Murasaki, abandoning all the women who depended on him, abandoning the son he could never acknowledge. But staying meant watching everything burn. On the night before his departure, Genji made his rounds through his palace, saying goodbye to each of his women. The scene was heartbreaking. Dozens of beautiful, accomplished women weeping for the man who had been the center of their world. Murasaki's farewell was the hardest. She had stood by him through everything, had forgiven him for the unforgivable, had built a life around loving him despite his flaws. "Will you come back?" she asked. "I promise," he replied, though neither of them knew if it was a promise he could keep. At dawn, Genji left the capital for Suma, a desolate beach town where he would spend the next several years in exile, cut off from everything and everyone he loved. But sometimes the greatest redemption comes from the deepest fall. Suma was the end of the world as far as Genji was concerned. Picture the most beautiful, sophisticated man of his age, accustomed to palace luxury and constant adoration, suddenly living in a rough beach hut with only a handful of loyal servants. The contrast was brutal. But something remarkable happened during those years of exile. Stripped of all his advantages, forced to confront himself without the constant distraction of court life and romantic conquest, Genji began to mature in ways he never had before. He spent his days writing poetry that captured the pain of separation, letters to Murasaki that conveyed depths of feeling he'd never expressed before. He studied seriously for the first time in years, reading philosophy and history without the pressure of court performance. Most importantly, he began to understand the cost of his actions. Away from the intoxication of power and beauty, he could see how his behavior had affected the people around him. The women he'd loved and left, the political chaos he'd created, the pain he'd caused even those closest to him. The isolation was crushing. Months would pass without word from the capital. When letters did arrive from Murasaki or his other women, they were filled with longing and barely contained desperation. His absence was destroying the delicate balance he'd created in his household. But then, just when it seemed like exile might be permanent, everything changed. The young Emperor Riezai Genji's secret son, though he didn't know it, began to have strange dreams. Night after night, he was visited by the ghost of Lady Kiritsubo, Genji's mother, who demanded her son's return. The dreams became so vivid, so disturbing, that the emperor couldn't function. Court physicians were baffled, religious leaders performed elaborate exorcisms. Nothing worked. Finally, one brave advisor suggested that perhaps the ghost wouldn't rest until Genji was recalled from exile. It was a risky political move, but the emperor's condition was becoming desperate. Orders were sent to Suma. Lord Genji was pardoned and commanded to return to the capital immediately. When the messenger arrived at Genji's beach hut with the imperial pardon, Genji fell to his knees and wept. After 3 years of exile, he was going home. But the man who returned to the capital was different from the one who had left. The experience of loss, of isolation, of confronting his own mortality had transformed him. He was still beautiful, still charming, still irresistible to women, but now there was depth behind the surface that hadn't existed before. His return created a sensation. The entire court turned out to welcome him back, and even his former enemies had to admit that exile had only enhanced his mystique. But the real test would be reuniting with the women he'd left behind. The reunion with Murasaki was everything Genji had dreamed of during those long years of exile. She had waited for him, despite offers of marriage from other men, despite the uncertainty of whether he would ever return. When she saw him again, the years of separation seemed to melt away in an instant. But both of them had changed. Murasaki had grown into a woman of remarkable strength and independence during his absence, managing his household, protecting the other women, maintaining their various complicated relationships. She had become a leader in her own right. Genji, meanwhile, brought back a maturity and emotional depth that made their relationship richer than it had ever been. The man who had once taken her trust for granted now treasured every moment they spent together. Year to year and day to day, he would think, gazing at her, she always had about her something marvelous, something new. Their love, when it fully blossomed, was extraordinary. It had survived violence, separation, betrayal, and exile. It was built on foundations that had been tested by every possible strain and had somehow emerged stronger. But Genji's return to court brought new challenges. His exile had made him a legend, and now everyone wanted a piece of that legend. Marriage proposals flooded in for various women in his household. Political factions tried to recruit him. The emperor showered him with honors and responsibilities. Most significantly, Genji was granted something unprecedented, the rank of honorary retired emperor. It was a title that acknowledged his unique position, too important to remain a mere nobleman, but unable to actually rule due to his birth circumstances. With this new status came the opportunity to build something lasting. Genji designed and constructed a magnificent palace complex called Rokujoin, the 6 Palaces, where all his women could live in harmony, each in her own beautiful wing suited to her personality and preferences. It was an architectural marvel, but more than that, it was a social experiment. Could love be shared without diminishing it? Could women find fulfillment in a polygamous arrangement if it was managed with genuine care and respect? For a while, it seemed like the answer was yes. The 6 Palaces became a center of cultural refinement, where poetry and music flourished, where the most talented artists and scholars gathered to share their work. But even paradise has its shadows, and the greatest tragedy of Genji's life was still to come. Success, it turned out, brought its own form of suffering. As Genji entered his 40s, he began to feel the weight of time in ways he never had before. His beauty, while still remarkable, was no longer the supernatural radiance of youth. His energy, once limitless, required more effort to maintain. Most painfully, he began to lose people he loved. The first major loss was his father, the emperor who had sacrificed so much to protect him. When the old man died, Genji felt orphaned all over again. The person who had understood his impossible position, who had loved him despite the chaos his existence created, was gone. Then came news that shattered him completely. Prince Rizai, his secret son, had discovered the truth about his parentage. The revelation came through a combination of court gossip and Rizai's own growing awareness of his resemblance to Genji. When he confronted his supposed father's advisors, they reluctantly confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The knowledge that he was illegitimate, that his entire reign was built on a lie, sent Rizai into a spiral of despair. He abdicated the throne and retreated to a monastery, unable to bear the weight of his false position. Genji watched his son's self-destruction with agonizing helplessness. He couldn't acknowledge their relationship publicly without destroying what remained of imperial legitimacy. He couldn't comfort Rizai without making the situation worse. All he could do was suffer in silence as his greatest sin claimed another victim. But the cruelest blow was still to come. Murasaki, who had been the stable center of his chaotic life for decades, began to show signs of a mysterious illness. At first it seemed minor. Fatigue, occasional weakness, nothing that couldn't be explained by the stress of managing such a complex household. But as months passed, her condition worsened. The best physicians were summoned, prayers were offered at every temple, but nothing helped. Murasaki was fading, and there seemed to be no medical cause anyone could identify. Genji threw himself into caring for her with desperate intensity. He cancelled all appointments, refused all visitors, spent every moment at her bedside. The man who had once divided his attention among dozens of women now had eyes only for the one who had anchored his entire emotional life. "I've been thinking," Murasaki told him during one of their last conversations, "about all the women you've loved. Do you think they were happy?" The question haunted Genji. Had his gift for inspiring love been a blessing or a curse? Had he enriched these women's lives or trapped them in impossible situations? "I think," he said carefully, "that happiness isn't simple. We found something together, all of us, that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Whether that was worth the pain, I don't know." Murasaki smiled, the expression still radiant despite her illness. "I know," she said. "It was worth it. Every moment of pain, every moment of doubt, it was worth it for what we found together." When she died, Genji felt like his world ended with her. Murasaki's death broke something fundamental in Genji that could never be repaired. The man who had spent his life surrounded by beauty, by women who adored him, by every luxury imaginable, suddenly found none of it meaningful. Without Murasaki's presence to anchor him, his magnificent palace felt like an elaborate tomb. He tried to continue as before, maintaining his relationships with his other women, fulfilling his court duties, preserving the complex social structures he had built. But those who knew him well could see that his heart had died with Murasaki. "He goes through the motions," one of his servants confided to another, "but Lord Genji isn't really here anymore." The irony was devastating. Genji had spent his entire life learning to love, collecting hearts like treasures, building a legacy of romantic connection that was unmatched in human history. But all of that accumulated love couldn't save the one person who mattered most. In his final months, Genji began to withdraw from the world. He spent hours in meditation, studying Buddhist texts, preparing for a spiritual journey that felt more real to him than the physical world around him. He wrote letter after letter to Murasaki's spirit, pouring out feelings that he had never fully expressed while she lived. The poems from this period are considered some of the most beautiful in Japanese literature. Love songs to a ghost, apologies to someone who could no longer forgive him, promises to someone who could no longer hold him accountable. When death finally came for Genji, it was almost a relief. The servants found him in his favorite garden, surrounded by the lavender flowers that had always reminded him of Murasaki. He looked peaceful for the first time in months, as if he had finally found what he had been searching for. But here's where this incredible story takes its most remarkable turn. Because the tale of Genji's life, this complex, beautiful, tragic story of love and power and human frailty, wasn't just a legend passed down through oral tradition. It was written down in exquisite detail by someone who understood every nuance of court life, every subtlety of human emotion, every political implication of romantic scandal. And that person was a woman whose genius was so profound that she essentially invented the psychological novel 1,000 years before Europe figured out how to do it. Here's the most mind-blowing part of this entire story. Everything you just heard about Genji's life, it was created by a woman living in that same court, watching those same political dramas unfold, understanding better than anyone what it meant to navigate impossible relationships in a world designed to limit your choices. We know her only as Murasaki Shikibu, but that wasn't her real name. In the elegant world of the Heian court, real names were for servants. She was defined entirely by her relationships to men. Murasaki after her fictional heroine, Shikibu after her father's government position. But don't let the anonymity fool you. This woman possessed one of the most brilliant minds in human history. Picture this. While European warriors were bashing each other with clubs, while most literature consisted of simple heroic poetry and religious texts, this Japanese woman was writing a 1,000-page psychological masterpiece that wouldn't be matched in sophistication for 800 years. She was creating characters so complex, so recognizably human, that they still feel contemporary today. She was exploring themes of memory, time, loss, and human relationships with a depth that rivals Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time. Except she was doing it in the year 1008. How is this possible? The answer lies in one of history's greatest accidents. You see, Chinese writing was considered men's letters, prestigious, powerful, connected to government and scholarship. But Japanese writing, that was dismissed as women's hand, suitable only for personal diaries and love letters. The men, writing in Chinese, were tracked by centuries of tradition. Every poem had to follow classical forms, every story needed proper historical references. They were basically writing book reports on ancient texts. But the women? They had complete creative freedom. No rules, no traditions to follow, no need to prove their scholarly credentials. They could write about whatever they wanted, and what they wanted to write about was the human heart. Our anonymous author's brilliance showed up early. In her diary, itself a literary masterpiece, she reveals a childhood that shaped everything that followed. I was in the habit of listening with my brother as my father taught him lessons. I became unusually proficient at understanding those lessons with which he was struggling. My father, a most learned man, was always regretting this fact. "Just my luck," he would say. "What a pity she was not born a man." Imagine the frustration. Here's a mind capable of absorbing complex Chinese philosophy and statecraft, but she's forced to learn in secret, listening through doors while her less capable brother struggles with lessons that come naturally to her. This isn't just personal tragedy, it's the key to understanding how the Tale of Genji came to exist. At court, she was called Lady Chronicle by other women, a cruel nickname that mocked her learning. She describes herself as pretentious, awkward, difficult to approach, prickly, too fond of her tales. But here's what made her dangerous. She secretly mastered Chinese literature. While other court women gossiped and played games, she was reading the foundational texts of politics and philosophy. She was acquiring the tools of male power. "The other women gather behind my back," she wrote. "It's because she goes on like this that she is so miserable. What kind of lady is it who reads Chinese books?" Picture having to hide your intelligence because it makes others uncomfortable. That's what she lived with every day. But instead of letting it crush her, she channeled it into creating something unprecedented. In writing the Tale of Genji, she wasn't just entertaining court ladies during boring afternoons. She was making a statement about what literature could be. She was proving that stories about the human heart could be as important as chronicles of military campaigns. But here's the most remarkable part. She was doing all this while serving as lady-in-waiting to the Empress, managing her own complex position at court, and navigating the same treacherous social dynamics she was writing about. Drop a comment about what you think drove her to create this masterpiece, because the psychology behind it is fascinating. What our anonymous genius accomplished was nothing short of revolutionary. She took the dismissive women's handwriting system and used it to create something that changed literature forever. Think about what she was up against. This was the same time period when European literature consisted mainly of religious texts and simple heroic poetry. The most sophisticated narrative anyone in the West could imagine was basically brave warrior fights monster, gets treasure. But she was writing psychological complexity that feels completely modern. Characters who contradict themselves, who grow and change over time, who struggle with impossible moral choices. She was exploring trauma, memory, the nature of love and power, the way time shapes and reshapes our understanding of our own lives. When scholars compare the Tale of Genji to Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, they're not being poetic. Both novels actually share specific techniques, the way they handle memory and nostalgia, their focus on how people try to recreate lost relationships through new ones, their understanding that everything beautiful is temporary. Her novels tell of the suffering caused by desire, of the way human beings seek replacements rather than renouncing their earliest loves, and how everything withers, everything perishes, including grief itself. That's a modern professor describing both works. A Japanese woman in 1008 was exploring themes that European literature wouldn't touch for another 1,000 years. But here's what's even more incredible. She didn't just create a one-off masterpiece, she influenced all subsequent Japanese culture. Every piece of Japanese literature that followed measured itself against the Tale of Genji. Modern anime and manga still reference her characters and themes. She essentially created the template for how Japanese artists think about storytelling, character development, and the relationship between beauty and sadness. And she did it all while being dismissed as a pretentious bookworm by her contemporaries. But let's talk about what survival meant for brilliant women in Heian Japan, because that's really what this story is about. These women lived in a world where your options were brutally limited. You survived through male protection, father, husband, or lover. Without that, you faced becoming a nun, or, as the novels puts it, drowning yourself in the sea. So how did someone like our author not just survive, but thrive? The answer is strategic brilliance. The women of the Heian court created their own networks of power and support. They used the tools available to them, artistic talent, intelligence, political cunning, and turned them into influence. Our author wasn't the only woman creating masterpieces. There was Sei Shonagon, whose pillow book is one of the wittiest works ever written. There was the author of the Kagero Diary, who invented confessional memoir. Dozens of others, all using their supposed limitation, writing in women's hand, as a source of strength. These women competed with each other as much as they supported each other. Our author clearly disliked Sei Shonagon, describing her as everything she herself was accused of being, show-offy, too clever for her own good. But this competition drove innovation. Each woman pushed the others to greater artistic heights. They survived by being simultaneously subversive and conventional. They worked within the system while quietly revolutionizing it. They accepted their limitations while finding ways to transcend them. Our author turned her marginality into art. Her exclusion from male educational circles became the foundation for a new kind of literature. Her supposed inferiority became the source of her immortality. Imagine the courage it took to continue creating in the face of mockery and dismissal. Imagine the strength required to build something beautiful while being told you were worthless. That's what makes this story so powerful. Today, the Tale of Genji is recognized worldwide as one of the greatest achievements in literature. It's taught in universities, analyzed by critics, translated into dozens of languages. But this recognition took 1,000 years to achieve. For centuries, even in Japan, it was seen primarily as entertainment for women. Beautiful, elegant, but not serious literature. The way Chinese-influenced works by male authors were considered serious. It wasn't until modern critics began comparing it to European masterpieces that people fully grasped what our anonymous author had accomplished. When you realize that a novel written in 1008 shares sophisticated techniques with 20th century modernism, it forces you to reconsider everything you thought you knew about literary development. The comparison to Proust is particularly telling. Here are two works separated by nearly 1,000 years that explore identical themes using remarkably similar approaches. What does that tell us about human nature? About the universality of certain emotional experiences. But the impact goes beyond academic recognition. Modern Japanese culture, from literature to film to anime, still draws on themes and character types that our author created. The sensitive, beautiful, morally complex male protagonist, that's Genji's legacy. The strong woman who finds agency within restrictive circumstances, that's Murasaki's influence. Contemporary feminist scholars have found in the Tale of Genji a work that's remarkably sophisticated about power dynamics, gender roles, and the psychology of survival. Our author understood things about women's experiences that weren't articulated again in literature for centuries. She created characters who feel completely contemporary in their complexity, their contradictions, their refusal to be simple victims or heroes. What would you have done in her situation? Drop a comment about how you think you'd handle being that brilliant in a world designed to silence you. Our anonymous author's story raises questions that remain painfully relevant today. How do we nurture creativity in marginalized communities? What happens when brilliant people are systematically excluded from dominant cultural institutions? How much innovation comes from necessity, from having to find new ways to express truths that can't be spoken directly? The women of the Heian court found ways to turn disadvantage into advantage. Their exclusion from traditional male literary culture forced them to innovate, to create new forms, to find fresh approaches to exploring human experience. This pattern repeats throughout history. Jazz emerged from African American communities, excluded from mainstream musical institutions. The modern novel was shaped significantly by women writers who couldn't access traditional publishing systems. Some of the most revolutionary art comes from people who have no choice but to create something new. Our author understood this instinctively. She turned her marginality into strength, her exclusion into innovation, her anonymity into immortality. But let's think about the actual process of creation. This woman spent years crafting a 1,000-page novel while managing her position at court, serving the empress, navigating dangerous political dynamics. She was essentially running a double life, the obedient court lady by day, the literary revolutionary by night. The dedication required is staggering. The risk she was taking of being discovered, of being further marginalized, of having her work dismissed or destroyed, makes her achievement even more remarkable. In the end, we return to mystery. We don't know her real name. We don't know what she looked like or how her voice sounded. We don't know exactly when she died or how. But we know the most important thing. We know her mind. Through the Tale of Genji, through her diary, through fragments of poetry, we have access to one of the most brilliant, complex, psychologically sophisticated minds in human history. She gave us Prince Genji beautiful, flawed, human in ways that still surprise us 1,000 years later. She gave us Lady Murasaki, traumatized, resilient, capable of love that transcends its terrible origins. She gave us a world of aesthetic refinement and political complexity, of women finding power in powerlessness, of beauty that endures even as everything beautiful must fade. Most importantly, she proved that the greatest literature comes not from following rules, but from breaking them. Not from celebrating power, but from understanding its costs. Not from simplifying human nature, but from embracing its contradictions. The Tale of Genji remains startling because it refuses easy answers. Like its anonymous author, it exists in the spaces between categories, between romance and realism, between ancient and modern sensibilities. And perhaps that's the most fitting legacy for a woman who spent her life navigating the spaces between official recognition and actual achievement, between social constraint and creative freedom, between anonymity and immortality. She survives not in historical records, but in the imagination. Every time someone reads the Tale of Genji and recognizes themselves in its pages, she lives again. Every time a reader marvels at psychological insights that feel completely contemporary, she speaks across 1,000 years of silence. The Shining Prince was her creation, but she was the true miracle. A brilliant woman who found a way to turn limitation into liberation, silence into song, anonymity into eternal recognition. In a world designed to erase her, she created something too beautiful, too true, too psychologically complex to ever be forgotten. And in the end, perhaps that's the greatest victory of all. Her story, and Genji's, continues to resonate because it captures something eternally true about human nature. We are all caught between competing desires, all struggling to find meaning in temporary beauty, all searching for connection across the inevitable barriers of time, status, and mortality. In creating the world's first psychological novel, she didn't just entertain her contemporaries, she revealed possibilities for human understanding that we're still exploring today. Drop a comment about which part of this story surprised you most, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible tales from history that you never knew existed. The anonymous author of the Tale of Genji reminds us that genius appears in unexpected places, that the most important innovations often come from those society most wants to silence, and that sometimes the greatest strength lies in turning limitation into liberation.